The wind screamed like a dying animal across the Wyoming high plains, driving snow so thick that Clara Whitfield could no longer see her own hands when she held them before her face. October 1884 and winter had arrived 6 weeks early, with the fury of something that had been waiting patient and hungry for its moment to strike. She stood at a crossroads 8 miles from Silver Creek, watching the stagecoach disappear into the white fury. The driver's last words still hung in the frozen air between what she'd hoped for and what she was about to endure. "Town's dead, miss. Ain't nothing there but ghosts and one stubborn fool who won't leave. I got a schedule to keep and dying ain't on it. You want to freeze with the dead, that's your choice, but this coach is turning back to Laramie." Clara had argued. Of course she had argued. 28 years of learning to fight for every small mercy life occasionally granted had taught her that surrender was just death by another name. But the driver had been past listening, past caring, past any obligation he might have felt to a woman who'd paid good money for passage to a town that no longer wanted to exist. She'd watched him go, watched the coach become a shadow, then a suggestion, then nothing at all in the horizontal assault of snow that was already stealing the warmth from her body with methodical precision. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself with drama, but simply took what it wanted, degree by degree until there was nothing left to take. Her canvas traveling bag sat at her feet, growing heavier with accumulating snow. Everything she owned in the world reduced to items that could fit in a space smaller than a flour sack. 2 dresses, 1 pair of practical boots, a wool coat that had seemed adequate in Boston but was revealing itself to be a laughable defense against Wyoming weather. 3 letters tied with string, their ink already beginning to run from melted snow. The words of a mail-order bride advertisement she'd answered in desperation, bleeding into meaninglessness. And in the inner pocket of her dress, pressed against her ribs, where she could feel its weight with every breath, 17 cents. Not $17, 17 cents. The last fragments of what had once been her father's savings, her mother's silver, her own wages from 3 years in a textile factory, where the only thing more certain than the 60-hour weeks was the knowledge that 60 hours would never be enough to climb out of the hole poverty had dug beneath her feet. The wind shifted, and Clara tasted blood. She'd bitten her lip without realizing the cold already, making her clumsy, her body prioritizing core warmth over the extremities that let a person do useful things like hold reins or grip hope. She was going to die here. The thought arrived with neither panic nor resignation, but simple arithmetic. 8 miles to town in a blizzard she couldn't see through, wearing clothes designed for city streets, carrying everything she owned, and 17 cents that wouldn't buy her 30 minutes of warmth even if there were a fire to purchase. She'd survived her father's death when she was 12, survived her mother's remarriage to a man whose kindness lasted exactly as long as the wedding ceremony, survived leaving home at 17 with nothing but pride and the naive belief that hard work would be rewarded, survived 3 years in a factory that treated its machines better than its workers because machines cost money to replace, survived the slow understanding that Boston had no interest in allowing a woman without family or fortune or beauty to become anything more than a shadow passing through other people's stories. And now she would die on a Wyoming crossroads because a stagecoach driver had a schedule to keep, and she'd bet everything on a town that had given up before she'd even arrived. Clara bent to retrieve her bag, her fingers already clumsy with cold. The wind drove snow into her face hard enough to sting. She could barely feel her toes. Had it been an hour since the coach left, 20 minutes' time was becoming as unreliable as the ground beneath her feet, which she could no longer distinguish from the snow accumulating around her ankles. She started walking. Not toward Silver Creek because she had no idea which direction that was anymore. The crossroads marker that had stood 4 feet tall when the coach abandoned her was already buried to its post. She walked because standing still was death, and walking was death, but at least walking felt like a choice, felt like she was dying on her own terms, rather than terms dictated by a vindictive sky and a practical coachman who probably slept just fine knowing he'd left a woman to freeze. Her boot caught on something buried in the snow. She went down hard, her bag flying from her grip, her hands plunging into powder so cold it burned like fire. Clara stayed there for a moment on her knees in the snow and felt something close to laughter building in her chest. The kind of laughter that came when the universe revealed the punchline to a joke it had been setting up for 28 years. She'd left Boston to escape poverty, had scraped together $200 across 3 years of factory work, had sold her mother's last silver mirror and her father's pocket watch and 3 books that represented the entirety of her education beyond basic letters. Had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride in Wyoming Territory because staying in Boston meant accepting that her life would be nothing more than the space between exhaustion and sleep work and wages that never quite covered the cost of surviving to work again. The advertisement had promised security, a good man seeking a capable wife. A town that needed women, valued women, would give women opportunities the East had long since closed off behind doors marked with prices she'd never be able to pay. It had mentioned nothing about dying alone in an October blizzard 8 miles from a ghost town. Clara forced herself to stand. Her bag had vanished into the snow. She took 3 steps in the direction she thought it had gone and stopped when her boot found nothing but air, her weight tilting forward over what she realized with sharp terror was a drop-off, a gully maybe, a ravine, deep enough that she couldn't see the bottom through the snow. She stepped back, carefully, the way a person stepped when they understood that every movement might be their last useful action. The bag was gone. The dresses and boots and letters that had seemed so important 5 minutes ago were buried or tumbling into a ravine, or already being covered by snow that would hide them until spring thaw revealed whatever the winter had decided to preserve. She still had the coins pressed against her ribs. Not that it mattered. Not that anything mattered, except the arithmetic of cold versus flesh time versus temperature, and the simple fact that she'd lost feeling in her feet. "Follow my voice." The words came from somewhere in the white fury. A man's voice deep enough to carry over the wind, but not shouting. The kind of voice that suggested the speaker had no doubt it would be heard and obeyed. Clara turned, searching the blizzard for the source, seeing nothing but variations of white on white. "Don't stop moving," the voice continued closer now. "Every second you stand still is a second colder. Follow my voice and don't stop." She walked toward the sound because it was either that or freeze. Her boots found a purchase on what felt like solid ground. The voice kept calling, not words now, but just sound, a steady bass note that gave her something to navigate toward when all other navigation had become impossible. A shape emerged from the storm, horse first, massive, and dark steam rising from its nostrils. Then the rider tall enough that even seated he seemed to loom, wrapped in a heavy coat with fur at the collar and a wide-brimmed hat that channeled snow away from a face she could barely make out in the failing light and driving weather. "Can you ride?" the man asked. Clara tried to answer and discovered her jaw had locked with cold. She managed a nod instead. The man dismounted in a single fluid motion that suggested he'd done this 10,000 times in weather both better and worse than this. He was tall, she realized. Tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face, though there wasn't much to see beyond a dark beard and eyes that were studying her with the kind of assessment a person gave to livestock they were considering purchasing. "You're the one from the advertisement," he said. "Not a question." Clara managed to unlock her jaw enough to force words out. "The coach left me. Coach drivers aren't paid enough to die for passengers' poor decisions." He was already moving, pulling a heavy bearskin from his saddle, wrapping it around her shoulders with brisk efficiency. "Can you hold on?" "Where?" "Silver Creek, 8 miles northeast. We can make it before you lose your toes, but only if you stop asking questions and start moving." He lifted her onto the horse with the same ease he'd wrapped the bearskin, as though she weighed nothing more than a child. The saddle was still warm from his body. He swung up behind her, his arms bracketing hers as he gathered the reins, his chest against her back, providing heat she could barely feel through the layers of cold that had already claimed her. The horse started moving before Clara could process what was happening. Not a gallop, but a steady walk that suggested the animal knew this trail even when the trail had vanished beneath 2 feet of snow and counting. "Hold the saddle horn," the man said against her ear, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "If you fall, I won't find you again before the cold does." Clara gripped the horn with fingers she could no longer feel. The bearskin smelled of horse and smoke and something else, something that might have been lavender or might have been her imagination trying to supply pleasant sensory information when everything her body was currently experiencing screamed of cold and exhaustion, and the particular terror of having nearly died alone. They rode in silence. The man behind her was warm where she was cold, solid where she felt insubstantial, certain where she had nothing left but questions. His arms were steady on either side of her, not holding her exactly, but creating a space where she was contained and therefore safe in a world where everything beyond the horse's back had become hostile. Clara tried to mark the passage of time by the rhythm of the horse's walk, but gave up when the numbers stopped making sense. Minutes felt like hours. The cold that had been stealing her warmth degree by degree was now being held at bay by the bearskin and the heat of the man behind her, and the slowly rebuilding hope that she might not die today after all. Buildings emerged from the storm like ships materializing from fog. Not many buildings. Maybe 40 in total, laid out in the rough grid of a town that had been planned with optimism and was now revealing what happened when optimism encountered reality. Most of the structures were dark. A few showed signs of habitation, smoke from chimneys, a light in one window, another light 2 buildings down. Silver Creek, the man said unnecessarily. The town looked dead. Not dying, but actually dead. A corpse that hadn't yet admitted it should lie down. Windows were broken. Porches sagged. Snow had drifted against doorways with the particular patterns that suggested no one had opened those doors in months, maybe years. The man guided the horse toward the only building that showed clear signs of life. A 2-story structure with a painted sign that read, Henderson's Boarding House, in letters that might have been cheerful in summer, but looked bleak in the storm. He dismounted, then lifted Clara down with the same efficiency he'd shown lifting her up. Her legs buckled when her feet touched ground. She would have fallen if he hadn't caught her, one arm around her waist, supporting her weight until her knees remembered their function. Can you walk? Clara forced her legs to work. Yes. Then walk. Not cruel, but practical. The voice of a man who'd learned that coddling someone in danger was less kind than pushing them to save themselves. They crossed 10 feet of snow-covered boardwalk. The man opened the door without knocking and half-guided, half-carried Clara inside. Warmth hit her like a physical force. The boarding house interior was dim but blessedly warm, heated by a wood stove in the corner that was putting out enough heat to make the air shimmer. An older woman emerged from a doorway at the back, wiping her hands on an apron, her face showing surprise that quickly shifted to concern when she saw Clara. Jack Morrison, what have you brought me? Mail-order bride. Found her at the crossroads. Jack was already unwrapping the bearskin from Clara's shoulders. Coach left her. The woman made a sound that was equal parts disgust and resignation. Of course it did. Driver's been turning back since the storm hit. Bring her to the kitchen. Jack guided Clara through the boarding house common room into a kitchen that was even warmer than the front room heat radiating from a cast-iron stove where something that smelled like beef stew was bubbling in a pot. The older woman was already moving, pulling out a chair, pushing Clara into it, examining her with quick, efficient movements. I'm Ida Henderson. This is my boarding house, such as it is. You can call me Ida because we don't stand on ceremony when people are half frozen. She was talking as she worked, pulling off Clara's sodden coat, checking her hands and face for signs of frostbite. Jack, get the kettle on. We need hot water. Jack moved to comply without argument, which told Clara that Ida Henderson was the kind of woman who expected obedience and generally received it. Ida kept up her examination. What's your name, girl? Clara Whitfield. From where? Boston. Long way to come for a ghost town. Ida was pulling off Clara's boots now, checking her toes with fingers that were gentle despite the briskness of her movements. Can you feel this? Barely. That's actually good. Means you're not too far gone. Ida looked up at Jack. Get her some dry clothes from the chest upstairs. Women's room, second door. Jack left without speaking. Clara watched him go, getting her first real look at the man who'd saved her life. Tall, as she'd noted, probably in his 40s, with salt and pepper showing in his dark beard and hair that needed cutting. Broad-shouldered the way men got when they worked with their hands. Burn scars visible on both hands, the kind of scarring that came from years of handling hot metal. Don't mind Jack, Ida said, catching Clara's attention. He's got the manners of a hibernating bear, but he's good in a crisis. Only reason you're alive is because he rides the perimeter every day checking for stragglers who don't have the sense God gave a goat. Clara wanted to defend herself, but couldn't find the words. Ida was right. Coming to Silver Creek had been an act of desperation, masquerading as courage, and desperation was just another name for not having better options. Jack returned with clothes, simple cotton dress, wool stockings, undergarments that were worn but clean. Ida took them and made a shooing motion at Jack. Out! I'll get her changed and warmed up. Jack left without argument. Ida helped Clara strip out of her wet clothes with brisk efficiency, then helped her into the dry ones. The dress was too large in the shoulders and too short at the hem, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered. The stockings were thick enough to make Clara's toes begin the painful process of waking up. Sit, Ida commanded, pushing Clara back into the chair. She ladled stew into a bowl, set it in front of Clara with a spoon and a piece of bread that looked like it had been baked that morning. Eat slowly. Your stomach's going to want to reject the first few bites, but push through. You need calories to generate heat. Clara ate. Ida was right about her stomach. The first spoonful wanted to come back up. She forced it down and kept going, each bite a little easier than the last, the warmth of the food beginning to spread through her chest like the sun emerging from behind clouds. Jack returned when Clara was halfway through the bowl. He'd removed his coat, revealing a work shirt that had seen better days, and suspenders that held up canvas trousers stained with soot and what might have been rust. He poured himself coffee from a pot on the stove and leaned against the counter, watching Clara with those same assessing eyes. You came here to marry me, he said. Not a question. Clara set down her spoon. The advertisement said a good man in Silver Creek was seeking a capable wife. The advertisement was placed without my knowledge or consent by Sam Briggs, the man who runs what's left of the general store. He thought I needed a wife. I told him I didn't. He placed the advertisement anyway. Jack's voice was flat, delivering information without emotion. So here's the situation, Miss Whitfield. You came a long way for nothing. I don't need a wife. Didn't want one. Still don't. But Tom Bradley runs cattle 10 miles south, and he takes a supply wagon to Laramie every Friday. 3 days from now. You can ride out with him. The words landed like stones. Clara felt something in her chest tighten. That wasn't the cold and wasn't hunger. I have nowhere to go. Not my problem. Jack drained his coffee. Didn't ask you to come. Can't afford to keep you. Tom's wagon leaves at dawn Friday. Be ready. He left the kitchen. Clara heard the front door open and close, felt the brief intrusion of cold air from outside, then nothing but the sound of wind and the crackle of fire in the stove, and Ida Henderson's sigh. He's not wrong, Ida said gently, but he's not entirely right either. Jack's wife died 3 years back. Childbirth. Baby died too. He's been alone ever since, and alone has made him forget how to be anything else. Clara stared at her bowl. The stew was still steaming, but she'd lost her appetite. I have 17 cents. How long will that last me here? Ida was quiet for a moment. Room and board is $2 a week, meals included. So I have enough for 3 days. You have enough for however long it takes. Ida refilled Clara's bowl without asking. Eat, then I'll show you to a room. Tomorrow you can worry about everything else. Tonight you're going to sleep in a warm bed and be grateful you didn't freeze to death on a Wyoming crossroads. Clara ate because there was nothing else to do. The stew tasted like hope, which was probably just her body's desperate attempt to find meaning in survival. When the bowl was empty, Ida led her upstairs to a small room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over a street where snow was still falling. Sleep, Ida said. Everything's worse when you're tired. Clara climbed into the bed and discovered Ida was right about one thing. The bed was warm. Warm enough that she could feel her body beginning to unknot muscles she hadn't realized were clenched, finally releasing. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her. She woke to sunlight and the sound of hammering. The storm had passed. Clara went to the window and looked out over Silver Creek in daylight, seeing for the first time what the blizzard had hidden. A town built for 300 that now housed maybe a dozen. Buildings that had been painted cheerful colors were faded and peeling. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, but currently held only snow and the tracks of a single horse. And at the far end of the street, a forge with smoke rising from its chimney and the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil. Jack Morrison, working. Clara dressed in the borrowed clothes and went downstairs. The boarding house was empty except for Ida in the kitchen frying eggs and bacon with the efficiency of someone who'd fed hungry people for 40 years. "Sit," Ida commanded. "We'll talk while you eat." Clara sat. Ida put a plate in front of her loaded with more food than she'd seen in a single meal in 6 months. Eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, bread with butter, a luxury that made the 17 cents in her pocket feel even more pathetic. "Silver Creek had 300 residents in 1880, Ida said, pouring coffee. "Mine was good. Silver, mostly some copper. Town grew fast the way boomtowns do. Built too much planned for a future that turned out to be shorter than anyone expected. Mine closed in 1882. Vein played out. Owners left. Families left. By winter of 1883, we were down to 40 people. Then we lost 4 more that winter. Old folks mostly. Too cold, too isolated, no supplies getting through." Clara ate while Ida talked the food, giving her something to do with her hands while her mind processed what she was hearing. "Now we're 12, Ida continued. "Me, Jack, Sam Briggs, who runs the general store on Credit and Hope, Tom Bradley, who ranches 10 miles south and is the closest thing we have to a connection with the outside world. 8 others scattered in the buildings that aren't quite ready to collapse. Everyone else left. Can't blame them. Town's dying. Has been for 3 years. We're just too stubborn to admit it's time to bury the corpse." "Then why did Sam place the advertisement?" Ida smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Because Sam's an optimist and an idiot, and sometimes those are the same thing. He thought if Jack got married, settled down proper, maybe other families would stay. Maybe new families would come. Maybe Silver Creek could be something more than 12 people waiting for the next winter to kill a few more of us." Clara set down her fork. "I should leave Friday, like Jack said." "That's certainly an option." Ida refilled Clara's coffee. "Or you could stay." "I have 17 cents. That won't even buy me a week." "Then you better figure out how to earn more than 17 cents. Ida leaned back, studying Clara the way Jack had studied her, but where Jack's assessment had been practical, Ida's was knowing. "What did you do in Boston?" "Worked in a textile factory, operated looms. Before that, when I first left home, I did bookkeeping for a printer. Kept his ledgers, managed his accounts." "Bookkeeping," Ida said the word like it tasted interesting. "Sam's ledgers are a disaster. Has been for years. He can't keep track of what he's owed, what he owes, what he has in stock. Every 6 months he does an inventory and discovers he's either richer or poorer than he thought, and neither one makes him happy." "How much would you charge to organize his books?" Clara did the arithmetic in her head. 50 cents a day for a week. That's $3.50, enough for room and board with $1.50 left over." "Then you better go talk to Sam." Ida stood, began clearing plates. "He opens the store at 9. It's 8:15 now. Gives you time to wash up and look like someone he'd trust with his money." And Clara went upstairs, washed with cold water from a basin, braided her hair into something that looked professional rather than desperate. She stared at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin and saw a woman who was 28 years old and looked 40, worn down by 3 years of factory work and the slow understanding that Boston had nothing to offer her but more of the same. Silver Creek might be dying, but it was dying slowly enough that a clever woman could make something of the time between now and the end. She went downstairs. Ida was waiting by the front door with Clara's coat dried overnight by the stove and smelling of wood smoke. "Sam's store is 3 buildings down, can't miss it. It's the only one with a sign that isn't falling off." Ida helped Clara into the coat. "And Clara, Jack's wrong about a lot of things, but he's not wrong about this place being on borrowed time. Whatever you decide knowing that Silver Creek might not exist in 6 months." Clara stepped out into a morning that was crystalline with cold and bright enough to hurt her eyes. The snow from yesterday's storm lay pristine and unmarked, except for the tracks leading from the boarding house to the forge, and from the forge to a building 3 down that had a sign reading "General Store" in letters that were, as Ida had noted, barely hanging on. The store door opened with a bell's cheerful ring that seemed inappropriate for a ghost town. Inside, a man who had to be Sam Briggs looked up from behind a counter. He was maybe 60, thin in the way of men who forgot to eat, with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose and an expression that shifted from surprise to hope so quickly it was almost painful to watch. "You're her," he said. "The bride. Jack said you'd be leaving Friday." "Jack doesn't get to make that decision." Clara crossed to the counter, taking in the store as she went. Shelves that were mostly empty, goods that were covered in dust. A ledger on the counter that lay open to a page covered in numbers that made her fingers itch to correct. "I'm Clara Whitfield. I understand your books need organizing." Sam's face lit up like she'd offered him salvation instead of bookkeeping. "Did Ida tell you?" "Yes, Lord, yes. I've been meaning to sort it out for 3 years, but there's never time, and I'm not good with figures, and every time I try to make sense of it, I end up more confused than when I started." Clara pulled the ledger toward her, flipped through pages that confirmed her initial assessment. The bookkeeping wasn't just bad, it was actively wrong. Debits in the credit column, dates that jumped backward and forward, entries that referenced people who might be customers, or might be suppliers, or might be Sam's fever dreams for all the clarity they provided. "This is going to take more than a week," she said. Sam wrung his hands. "I can't afford more than a week." "Can barely afford a week. Business isn't what it was." Most folks who stayed in Silver Creek run tabs because they don't have cash, and I don't press them, because pressing your neighbors when times are hard isn't Christian. Clara closed the ledger. "Here's what I see. You have maybe $200 in outstanding debts. People who've been buying on credit for so long, they've forgotten they owe you. You have inventory you think is worthless, but might not be if you knew what you had. And you have no system for tracking what comes in or what goes out, which means you're hemorrhaging money every day and don't even know it." Sam stared at her like she'd spoken prophecy. "Can you fix it?" "I can organize it. Then you'll know what you're working with. Whether that's fixable is up to you." Clara pulled out a pencil from the cup on the counter. 50 cents a day. I'll work 6 hours. That'll get me through the first pass on your ledgers and give you a real picture of where you stand. After that, we can talk about whether there's anything worth fixing." Sam extended his hand. "Deal." They shook on it. Clara spent the rest of the morning in the store's back room, surrounded by 3 years of chaotic bookkeeping and the slowly growing understanding that Silver Creek's problems were even worse than she'd imagined. Clara spent 3 days in the back room of Sam Briggs's general store, surrounded by ledgers that told the story of a town's slow death through numbers that refused to add up correctly. The work was familiar in the way that breathing was familiar, something her hands knew how to do even when her mind was occupied with larger questions. Questions like whether she was organizing the financial records of a corpse or documenting the last gasp of something that might yet be saved. The numbers told their own story, and it wasn't pretty. $270 in outstanding debts scattered across 11 remaining households. Inventory that Sam had purchased 3 years ago still sitting on shelves gathering dust because the people who might have bought it had left for places with better prospects. A credit system that had started as neighborly kindness and metastasized into a trap where everyone owed everyone else and nobody had the cash to settle accounts. But underneath the chaos, Clara found something else. A pattern. The debts weren't evenly distributed. 3 families owed most of the money. Everyone else owed small amounts, the kind of debts that accumulated when you bought flour on Tuesday because you couldn't afford to buy it on Monday, and promised to pay on Friday, but Friday came and went, and Sam was too kind to press the issue. She made lists. Who owed what? Who could afford to pay if pressed? Who was so deep in the hole that pressing them would just make them leave, which would make Silver Creek's problems worse instead of better. By the end of the 3rd day, she had a picture of the town's economy that was both clearer and more depressing than she'd hoped. Sam read her report with the expression of a man discovering his house was on fire and had been for quite some time. $270, he said, his voice hollow. That's more than I make in a year at current business levels. It's also not as bad as it looks. Clara pointed to her list. 30% of this is bad debt. People who left town or died. You'll never collect that. But the remaining 70% is salvageable if you're willing to do 2 things. Sam looked up from the ledger. What 2 things? First, you forgive the oldest debts. Anything more than a year old you write off. Tell people you're starting fresh, give them a clean slate. That buys you goodwill and removes the psychological weight of debt that feels unpayable. That's 40% of what I'm owed. It's 40% of money you were never going to see anyway. Better to forgive it officially and earn gratitude than let it sit on your books, making everyone feel guilty and resentful. Clara moved to the next item on her list. Second, for the remaining 60%, you institute a payment plan. Everyone pays 10% of their current balance per month. That's manageable for most households, and it gets money flowing again. Sam was quiet for a long moment, studying the numbers with an expression that suggested he was doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with ledgers and everything to do with survival. If I do what you're suggesting, and people actually pay, I'll collect about $160 over the next 6 months. Yes. That's still less than the $270 I'm owed. But it's $160 you don't currently have. Clara leaned back in her chair. The question isn't whether this plan is perfect. It's whether it's better than what you're doing now, which is slowly going broke while pretending you're not. Sam closed the ledger with a finality that suggested he'd made a decision. When can you start implementing this? I already have. I've prepared individual statements for each household showing what they owe and what their monthly payment would be under the 10% plan. All you need to do is deliver them and explain that you're offering fresh terms because times are hard and neighbors help neighbors. You did all this in 3 days. I did all this in 6 hours a day for 3 days, which means I'm owed $9. Clara held out her hand. 50 cents times 18 hours. Sam paid her in silver, counting out the coins with hands that shook slightly. $9. Combined with what little she'd arrived with, Clara now had enough money for 4.5 weeks of room and board at Ida's, assuming she didn't eat much and didn't need anything else, which meant she had 4.5 weeks to figure out what came next. She walked back to the boarding house through afternoon light that turned the snow golden and made Silver Creek look almost beautiful, the way dying things sometimes did when you caught them at the right angle. The forge was quiet. Jack Morrison's workday apparently ended earlier than Sam's. Clara wondered what a blacksmith did with his evenings in a town that had no social life and no future, then decided it was none of her business. Jack had made it clear she was leaving Friday. That was tomorrow. She should be packing, preparing for the wagon ride to Laramie and whatever came after that. Instead, she found herself walking past the boarding house to the forge. The building was larger than she'd expected, a stone structure with a roof that looked newer than the rest of the town. The double doors were closed against the cold, but not locked. Clara pushed one open and stepped into a space that smelled of coal smoke and hot metal and oil, a combination that should have been unpleasant, but somehow wasn't. The forge itself dominated the center of the space, a massive stone structure with a chimney that rose through the roof. Tools hung on the walls in arrangements that suggested both functionality and pride of ownership. Hammers of different sizes and weights. Tongs, files, implements Clara couldn't name but could recognize as the instruments of a craft that turned raw metal into useful objects. Jack Morrison stood at a workbench near the back cleaning tools with the methodical attention of someone performing a ritual. He looked up when Clara entered, his expression shifting from concentration to something that might have been annoyance but was too controlled to read clearly. "Store's closed," he said. "If you need something, come back tomorrow." "I don't need anything from the store." Clara moved deeper into the forge, looking at the space the way she'd looked at Sam's ledgers, reading the story it told. "I wanted to see where you work." "Why?" "Because this is the only business in Silver Creek that isn't dying." She gestured at the tools, the organization, the evidence of ongoing work. "Sam's store is hemorrhaging money. The boarding house barely breaks even, but this place looks like it's actually functioning." Jack set down the file he'd been cleaning. "I'm a blacksmith. People need horseshoes, wagon repairs tools. That doesn't stop just because a town is dying. People 10 miles away need those things. Tom Bradley's ranch, other homesteads. You're serving a radius that's larger than Silver Creek." Clara pulled out the mental calculations she'd been doing since she'd first seen the forge. "How many orders do you complete in a week? That's not your business. Humor me." Jack stared at her for a long moment, and Clara got the sense she was being assessed again, weighed against some internal standard she couldn't see. Finally he shrugged. 10 to 15 items depending on complexity, horseshoes mostly, some wagon work, occasional tool repair or custom orders. At what price? Depends on the item. Clara did the math in her head. Average it out. What do you make per item? $2 to $3 for simple work, $5 to $10 for complex custom orders. So you're clearing somewhere between $20 and $100 a week depending on the work mix. Clara looked around the forge again, seeing it with new appreciation. That's more than the rest of Silver Creek's economy combined, which is why I don't need a wife or a town or anything except to be left alone to do my work. Jack returned to cleaning his tools. Tom's wagon leaves at dawn. Be ready. Clara didn't move. What if I told you I could increase your income by 30% without increasing your workload? Jack's hands stilled. I'd say you don't know anything about blacksmithing. You're right, I don't. But I know about bookkeeping and business organization and the fact that you're probably losing money because you don't track your costs, don't optimize your pricing, and don't market your services beyond word of mouth. Clara pulled out her pencil and a scrap of paper she'd brought from the store. Let me see your ledger, just your business records, 5 minutes. If I can't find inefficiencies, I'll be on Tom's wagon tomorrow, and you'll never see me again. Jack considered this for longer than Clara expected. Finally, he crossed to a small desk in the corner and pulled out a ledger that was significantly neater than Sam's, but still showed the work of someone who kept records because he had to, not because he understood why they mattered beyond tax purposes. Clara opened the ledger and started reading. Within 3 minutes, she'd found 6 things that made her fingers itch to correct. Within 5 minutes, she'd identified the pattern that was costing him money he didn't even know he was losing. You're undercharging for custom work, she said. A custom knife takes you 4 hours. You charge $7. That's $1.75 per hour, which seems reasonable, except you're not accounting for material costs or tool depreciation or the fact that custom work requires skill that should command a premium. Jack crossed his arms. I charge what people can afford to pay. No, you charge what you think they can afford, which isn't the same thing. Clara pointed to an entry from 2 months ago. This custom hinge set for Tom Bradley. You charged $8. Tom Bradley runs a ranch that grosses $2,000 a year. He could afford $15 for custom hinges, and he would have paid it because custom work has value that standard work doesn't. Tom's a friend. Tom's a customer. There's a difference. Clara flipped through more pages. You're doing this consistently. Undercharging friends. Undercharging locals, leaving money on the table because you're too proud to ask for what your work is worth. Jack took the ledger back. If I raised my prices, people would go elsewhere. Where the next blacksmith is 40 miles away in Laramie, you have a geographic monopoly and you're not using it. Clara leaned against the workbench. I'm not suggesting you gouge people. I'm suggesting you charge fair market value for skilled labor. A 10% increase across the board would net you an extra $2 to $10 per week. Over a year, that's $100 to $500 you're currently leaving in other people's pockets. Jack was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the forge's windows with the promise of weather that didn't care about human economics or pride. Why do you care? He asked finally. You're leaving tomorrow. My business isn't your concern. Because I spent 3 days organizing Sam's chaos and discovered that Silver Creek's entire economy runs on hope and credit, and the willingness of 12 people to keep pretending they're not living in a ghost town. Clara gestured at the forge. This is the only thing in Silver Creek that actually makes money. If you fail, the town fails, and I'd rather not have crossed half a continent to watch a place die because its only profitable business owner was too stubborn to charge fair prices. I never asked you to cross half a continent. No, but you saved my life 3 days ago, which means I owe you something. Consider this payment. Jack studied her with those winter sky eyes that seemed to see more than Clara wanted to reveal. You want to stay. I don't have anywhere else to go. That's not the same as wanting to stay. Clara chose her words carefully. Boston taught me that working 60 hours a week in a factory will never be enough to climb out of poverty. I came to Wyoming because the advertisement promised opportunity. Sam's advertisement was fraudulent, but the opportunity might not be. Silver Creek is dying, but it's dying slowly enough that a clever person could make something of the time between now and the end. A clever person, Jack said slowly, or a desperate one. Sometimes those are the same thing. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind and the cooling ticks of the forge's stones releasing their heat. Jack finally nodded a single sharp movement that conveyed agreement without enthusiasm. "You can keep Sam's books if he'll have you, but you don't work for me. I don't need help, don't want an apprentice, and don't require whatever improvements you think you can make to my business." "Understood. And when this town finally gives up and dies, don't say I didn't warn you." "I won't." Jack turned back to his tools. Clara recognized dismissal when she saw it. She left the forge and walked back to the boarding house, where Ida was waiting with the expression of someone who'd been watching through the window and had thoughts about what she'd seen. "Well," Ida asked, "I'm staying." "For how long?" "However long it takes." Ida smiled. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." That night Clara lay in her narrow bed and listened to the wind testing the boarding house's walls for weaknesses. She'd bought herself time, but time was just an empty container waiting to be filled with either meaning or more waiting. The question was what she intended to fill it with. Sleep came eventually, and with it, dreams of numbers that wouldn't balance, and towns that existed in that liminal territory where hope and despair took turns leading, where every choice meant postponing one kind of ending for another. She woke to hammering again, but this time she recognized it for what it was. Not the sound of work, but the sound of determination, the rhythm of a man who decided that giving up wasn't an option, even when all the reasonable options had been exhausted. Clara dressed and went downstairs to find Ida already cooking breakfast. The older woman looked up with a knowing smile. "Tom's wagon left an hour ago." "I wasn't on it." "I noticed." Ida plated eggs and bacon. "Sam came by earlier, said to tell you he's calling a town meeting for tomorrow evening. Wants you to present your plan for the cooperative debt collection to everyone at once. Thinks it'll go over better coming from you than from him." Clara sat down to breakfast with the uncomfortable realization that she'd just become more involved in Silver Creek's survival than she'd intended. What's a town meeting in a place with 12 people intimate? Ida poured coffee. "But it matters. These 12 people are all that's left. If they give up, Silver Creek becomes a name on old maps and nothing more. If they fight, maybe we last another year, maybe 2. And then what? Then we figure out the next year." Ida sat down across from Clara. "That's how survival works in places like this. You don't plan for decades. You plan for seasons, winter to spring, spring to summer. Each season you survive is a victory, and if you get enough victories in a row, eventually you look back and realize you've built something. Or you look back and realize you wasted years fighting for something that was always going to fail. That's the risk." Ida sipped her coffee. "But here's what I've learned in 68 years. The only difference between waste and investment is whether you give up before the end. If you quit, it was waste. If you see it through, it was investment. The outcome might be the same either way, but at least with investment, you can hold your head up." Clara ate her breakfast and thought about investment. About the 3 years she'd spent in a Boston textile factory, investing her time and labor into wages that never quite added up to freedom. About the $200 she'd scraped together invested into a mail-order bride advertisement that had brought her to a dying town where the only man seeking a wife hadn't actually been seeking one. About the $9 she'd earned organizing ledgers, and the knowledge that $9 could become 18, could become more, if she was willing to invest time into a place that might not exist in 6 months. The town meeting happened in the forge because it was the only building large enough to hold 12 people comfortably, and warm enough that nobody would freeze during the discussion. Clara arrived early and found Jack already there, banking the forge fire to a level that provided heat without filling the space with smoke. "Sam tell you about this?" he asked without looking up. "Ida told me." "You don't have to come. It's town business. You're not town." "Sam asked me to present the debt collection plan. Sam's an optimist who thinks if he can just get everyone on the same page, Silver Creek will magically stop dying." Jack finally looked at her. "It won't. Numbers don't change reality. They just measure it. Numbers also reveal possibilities that reality likes to hide," Clara said. "I spent 3 days studying this town's economy. It's bad, but it's not terminal. Not yet." People began arriving before Jack could respond. Sam Briggs, first nervous and carrying papers, then Ida walking with a cane Clara hadn't seen her use before. Tom Bradley came next, a rancher in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent 40 years working land that fought back. Others followed. A couple in their 70s who introduced themselves as the Pattersons and explained they ran what was left of the town's small farming operation. A woman named Sarah Mitchell who did laundry and sewing. 2 brothers, the Donnellys, who worked odd jobs. 12 people total counting Clara, a town that could fit around a forge fire. Sam stood near the workbench and cleared his throat with the nervousness of someone about to deliver bad news. "Thank you all for coming. I know times are hard and getting harder. That's why we're here. Miss Whitfield has been working on my books, and she's found some things I think everyone needs to hear." Clara stood feeling the weight of 12 pairs of eyes, 12 lives that were betting their survival on numbers that might or might not add up to hope. "Silver Creek's economy is in trouble," she said, because there was no point in sugarcoating facts that everyone already knew. "The general store is owed $270 in outstanding debts. Most households owe something. Some owe a lot. Nobody's paying because nobody has cash, and nobody has cash because there's no money flowing through the economy." She saw heads nodding. This wasn't news. "But here's what you don't know. 70% of that debt is collectible if we approach it correctly. Sam's willing to forgive anything older than a year, which clears 40% of the total. For the remaining 60%, he's proposing a payment plan, 10% per month. That's manageable for most households if we make one change." "What change?" Tom Bradley asked. Clara pulled out the proposal she'd been working on for 2 days. "We create a cooperative purchasing system. Instead of each household buying supplies individually from Sam, we pool our money and buy in bulk from suppliers in Laramie. That reduces costs by 20 to 30% for basics like flour, sugar, coffee cloth. The savings get split. Half goes to paying down debts. Half goes back to households as reduced costs." Silence. Clara could see people doing arithmetic in their heads, trying to figure out if this was salvation or just another scheme that would fail like everything else had failed. Mrs. Patterson spoke first. "How would the pooling work? We don't all need the same things at the same times. We do it quarterly, 4 times a year. Everyone submits orders for what they'll need for the next 3 months. We combine orders, buy bulk split shipments. The coordination takes work, but the savings are substantial." "Who does the coordination?" one of the Donnelly brothers asked. "I will," Clara said. "If the town agrees to the system, I'll manage the logistics, ordering, accounting, distribution. In exchange, I'd ask for a small fee from the savings, 1% of the total bulk purchase amount." Sam pulled out a paper with numbers. "If we're talking about $300 per quarter in combined purchases, 1% is $3. That's fair compensation for the work involved." Tom Bradley leaned forward. "What if this fails? What if we commit to 3 months of coordinated purchasing and the system doesn't work? Then we've lost nothing except the effort of trying." Clara met his eyes. "You're currently paying full price for everything and drowning in debt. This system reduces your costs immediately and creates a mechanism for paying down what you owe. The only way it fails is if people don't participate or don't pay their quarterly contributions." More silence. Then Ida Henderson's voice, carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in Silver Creek longer than most of the town's current buildings had existed. "I'm in. Put me down for quarterly purchasing, and I'll prepay my store debt at the 10% rate starting next month." Her commitment broke the dam. Tom Bradley agreed. The Pattersons agreed. Sarah Mitchell agreed. Within 10 minutes, everyone except Jack had committed to the cooperative purchasing system and the debt payment plan. Sam looked like someone had just told him he'd won a lottery he hadn't remembered entering. "This is remarkable. Miss Whitfield, I can't thank you enough. Thank me when it works." Clara made notes on who'd committed to what. "First quarterly purchase will be in 2 weeks. I'll need everyone's orders by next Friday." The meeting broke up with more optimism than Clara had expected. People lingered, talking in small groups, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Silver Creek, the conversations didn't sound like funeral planning. Jack remained at his forge working on something that required his full attention. Clara waited until everyone else had left, then approached. "You didn't commit to the cooperative purchasing," she said. "I buy my supplies directly from manufacturers. Better quality, better prices." Jack didn't look up from his work. "Your system makes sense for household goods, doesn't make sense for specialty items." "Fair enough. But it's good work." Jack set down his hammer, finally looking at her. "You might actually pull this off." "Pull what off?" "Buying this town another season." He gestured at the forge, the tools, the evidence of his craft. "That's all any of us are doing, buying time, hoping that eventually all the bought time adds up to something worth the cost." Clara studied him in the forge light, seeing for the first time the exhaustion underneath the competence. Jack Morrison wasn't just a blacksmith. He was a man who'd decided to stay in a dying town because leaving felt like surrender, and surrendering felt like letting his dead wife and child down one more time. "Why did you stay?" she asked. "After your wife died, you could have left, started over somewhere that wasn't dying." Jack was quiet for so long, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he picked up a piece of iron stock, turned it over in his scarred hands. "Anna's buried here, her and the baby. They're in the cemetery, on the hill behind the church." His voice was matter-of-fact, delivering information without emotion. "Couldn't leave them. Couldn't take them. So I stayed." "That's not a reason, that's just geography." "Maybe." Jack returned the iron stock to its pile. "Or maybe I stayed because leaving would mean admitting that everything we tried to build here was for nothing. The town, the life, the future we planned. Anna deserves someone who keeps fighting, so I fight, even when fighting looks like just hammering iron in an empty town." Clara recognized Ida's words in different phrasing. "How long can you keep investing in something that's dying, however long it takes?" Jack met her eyes, and Clara saw something there that might have been respect or might have been recognition, the acknowledgement that they were both people who'd chosen to fight rather than quit, even when quitting was the reasonable choice. "Now get out of my forge. I have work to do." Clara left, and behind her she heard the hammer start again, that steady rhythm that meant someone was still fighting. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of organization and arithmetic. Clara collected quarterly orders from 11 households, calculated bulk quantities, wrote letters to suppliers in Laramie, negotiating prices and delivery terms. She set up a simple accounting system in the back room of Sam's store, tracking who'd ordered what and who owed what portion of the collective purchase. The work was familiar and therefore comforting. Numbers made sense in ways that people often didn't. A ledger balanced, or it didn't. A calculation was right, or it was wrong. There was clarity in arithmetic that Clara had learned to trust more than promises. Tom Bradley made the trip to Laramie with Clara's orders and came back 3 days later with 2 wagons full of supplies purchased at prices that made everyone's eyes widen. Flour for 2 cents a pound instead of 4, coffee for 12 cents a pound instead of 20, sugar cloth lamp oil, all at prices that were 30% below what they'd been paying. The distribution took a full day. Clara checked off items against her lists, calculated each household's share of the total cost, collected payment, or extended credit where necessary. By evening, everyone had their goods, and the town's first cooperative purchase was complete, with a savings of $90 spread across 11 households. Sam counted the money that had been paid toward old debts and looked like he might cry. $42, that's more than I've collected in the past 6 months combined. "It's a start," Clara said, because it was too early to call it success. But that evening, as she walked back to the boarding house through November cold, that was already promising a brutal winter, Clara allowed herself a moment of something that felt suspiciously like pride. She'd been in Silver Creek for 3 weeks. She'd earned $36 in fees and bookkeeping work. She had enough money for 18 weeks of room and board. And she'd helped create a system that might actually keep 12 people alive through the winter. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had 3 weeks ago when she'd been freezing to death at a crossroads. Ida was waiting with hot coffee and a smile that suggested she'd been watching Clara's progress with approval. "You're good at this." "At what?" "Building things. Most people tear down without meaning to. They complain, they give up, they decide nothing can be fixed, so why try? You see broken things and figure out how to make them work." Ida poured coffee for both of them. "That's rare. It's just bookkeeping and basic economics. It's leadership, and Silver Creek needs leadership more than it needs bookkeeping. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Leadership implies people following. I'm just organizing purchases and tracking debts. You stood in front of 11 people who've spent 3 years watching their town die and convinced them to try one more thing. That's leadership. Ida sipped her coffee. Jack sees it too. Watched you at the meeting. First time I've seen him pay attention to anything except his forge in 3 years. Jack thinks I'm wasting my time. Jack thinks everyone's wasting their time, including himself. He's been stuck since Anna died. This town's been stuck. Clara wanted to argue, but found she had no counter-argument. 3 weeks ago, she'd been freezing to death, abandoned by a stagecoach driver who'd decided her survival wasn't worth his schedule. Now she was sitting in a warm kitchen, drinking coffee, discussing the economics of saving a town that probably couldn't be saved. If that wasn't evidence of life's strange arithmetic, she didn't know what was. The door to the boarding house opened, bringing in cold air and Jack Morrison. He stomped snow off his boots and looked surprised to find Clara and Ida in the kitchen. Didn't mean to interrupt. You're not interrupting, Ida stood. I was just going to check on the stew. Jack, you'll stay for dinner. It wasn't a question. Ida disappeared into the pantry before Jack could decline, leaving him standing awkwardly in the doorway with Clara watching from the table. Coffee? Clara offered. Jack nodded and sat down across from her with the careful movements of someone entering territory that wasn't quite hostile, but wasn't welcoming either. Clara poured him a cup and watched him wrap his scarred hands around it the same way she had, seeking warmth. The cooperative purchase went well, he said after a long silence. It did. People are talking, saying maybe Silver Creek has a chance after all. People were always going to talk. The question is whether they keep participating once the novelty wears off. Jack smiled, a small expression that transformed his face from severe to almost approachable. You're a pessimist. I'm a realist. There's a difference. Not much of one. They drank their coffee in silence that was surprisingly comfortable. Outside, winter dark was settling over Silver Creek with the finality of something that knew its power and didn't need to rush. Clara studied Jack's hands, the weathered palms marked by decades of working with fire evidence written in scar tissue. Evidence of years spent working with metal hot enough to reshape, but also hot enough to destroy if you made a mistake. How long have you been a blacksmith? She asked. 24 years. Started apprenticing at 14. Journeyman at 18. Had my own forge by 22. And you came to Silver Creek when, 8 years ago, 1876. Anna and I were looking for a place to settle. Town was booming, needed a blacksmith. Seemed like Providence. Clara did the arithmetic. You've been here through the boom and the bust. Watched it all happen, the mine playing out, the families leaving, the slow understanding that we'd built a town on silver that ran out faster than anyone expected. Jack set down his empty cup. Now it's just 12 people pretending we're not living in a graveyard. 13, Clara corrected. I'm staying. Jack studied her with those winter eyes. Why, because I have less than $20 saved, a room at Ida's for 18 more weeks, and no better options than making this work. Clara met his gaze without flinching. And because someone needs to be the 13th person. Towns with 13 residents are still towns. Towns with 12 are just groups of stubborn individuals. That's not a reason. It's the only one I have. Ida returned with bowls of stew and bread that was fresh enough to still be warm. The three of them ate together, conversation flowing easier than Clara expected, discussing the logistics of winter survival and the probability of the road to Laramie staying passable, and the question of whether Sam's store would make it to spring. It felt almost normal, like something a family might do, gathering around a table while winter pressed against the windows. Clara hadn't felt anything resembling family since her father died 16 years ago. She'd forgotten what it tasted like, this casual intimacy of shared meals and comfortable silence. After dinner, Jack stood to leave. At the door he paused and looked back at Clara. The cooperative purchasing system. It's good work. If you can keep people committed through winter, it might actually save this town. He pulled on his coat. I was wrong about you being a waste of time. That's almost a compliment. It is a compliment. Don't push your luck. He left, and Clara helped Ida with the dishes, scrubbing plates, while thinking about the strange mathematics of human connection. 3 weeks ago, Jack Morrison had been a stranger who'd saved her life in a blizzard. Now he was something else. Not quite a friend, but no longer simply the blacksmith who didn't want a wife. "He likes you," Ida said, as if reading Clara's thoughts. "He tolerates me." For Jack, those are the same thing. Ida dried a plate with methodical care. Anna died hard. Childbirth that lasted 30 hours. Baby was breech, couldn't turn. She bled out in their bed upstairs in the apartment above the forge. He carried her down and buried her himself because the ground was frozen, and he didn't trust anyone else to do it right. Clara's hands stilled in the washwater. "He told you that—" "Didn't have to. I was there. Helped with the birthing, though there was nothing anyone could do once things went wrong." Ida stacked the dried plate. "Point is, Jack Morrison knows what loss tastes like. Knows it intimately. When he looks at you, he sees someone else who understands that flavor. That's why he tolerates you. Because you both know that survival isn't triumph. It's just what comes after you've lost everything that matters and decided to keep breathing anyway." Clara finished the dishes in silence, turning Ida's words over in her mind like stones being examined for hidden value. She'd come to Silver Creek expecting nothing except maybe shelter from the particular kind of poverty that ground you down to nothing in Boston. She'd found something else, a town dying slowly enough that clever people could make something of the time between now and the end, and a blacksmith who understood that staying was sometimes harder than leaving. That night, Clara lay in her narrow bed and listened to the familiar sound of Jack's hammer carrying through the cold air, working late as he apparently did most nights. The rhythm was steady, purposeful, the sound of someone who'd found meaning in the act of creation, even when creation seemed pointless. She fell asleep to that rhythm and dreamed of numbers that balanced perfectly, and towns that existed forever in the space between dying and dead, where every day was just another day of choosing to stay. Winter arrived in earnest the first week of December, bringing temperatures that turned breath to ice and made the 8-mile journey to Laramie a gamble with frostbite. Clara watched the thermometer outside Ida's kitchen window drop to 10 below zero and stay there for 3 days straight, the kind of cold that killed livestock and tested the limits of human endurance. Inside the boarding house, she worked on the second quarterly purchasing order, comparing prices from 3 different Laramie suppliers and calculating optimal order quantities for goods that would need to last through February. The arithmetic was straightforward, but the stakes were higher now. 11 households were depending on this system. If it failed, if the savings disappeared, or the logistics fell apart, Silver Creek's fragile economy would collapse, and the town would die faster than it was already dying. Sam visited twice a week now, bringing his ledgers for Clara to review and update. The debt payment plan was working better than anyone had expected. 8 of 11 households were paying their 10% monthly, and even the 3 households that occasionally missed payments were making good faith efforts. In 6 weeks, Sam had collected $93 against outstanding debts, more money than he'd seen in the previous year combined. But the real measure of success wasn't in Sam's ledgers. It was in the conversations Clara overheard when she walked through town. People talking about spring, about planting crops, about repairs they'd make to their houses when the weather warmed. It was a small shift, barely noticeable, but it mattered. Jack's forge remained the constant heartbeat of Silver Creek, the rhythm of his hammer marking time like a clock that measured days in horseshoes and wagon repairs instead of hours. Clara had taken to stopping by the forge once a week under the pretense of discussing the cooperative purchasing system, though both of them knew the real reason was something neither was willing to name. On a Thursday afternoon, when the temperature had climbed to an almost comfortable 20 degrees, Clara found Jack working on what looked like decorative ironwork, intricate scrolls and curves that had no practical purpose she could identify. "What is that?" she asked, watching him hammer a piece of iron that glowed orange in the forge fire. "Bracket for the church bell tower." Jack plunged the iron into water, creating a hiss of steam. "Reverend asked me to make something that would last. Original brackets are rusting through." "There's no Reverend in Silver Creek. Hasn't been for 2 years." Jack pulled the cooled iron from the water, examining it with critical eyes. "Doesn't mean there won't be one again. Church is still standing, Bell still works. Brackets should be ready for when someone comes. Clara understood then. This wasn't about a functional bracket. It was about hope dressed up as practical ironwork, about making something beautiful for a future that might never arrive but deserved to be prepared for anyway. "You're an optimist," she said. "I'm a blacksmith. I make things that last." Jack returned the iron to the forge, heating it for another round of shaping. Whether anyone's here to use them is someone else's problem. Clara watched him work for a while, mesmerized by the rhythm of heat and hammer, the way raw metal could be convinced to take new shapes through nothing more than fire and force and patient repetition. There was something almost meditative about it, this transformation of one thing into another. "Teach me," she said suddenly. Jack looked up, surprised. "Teach you what?" "Blacksmithing, the basics. How to heat iron, how to hammer it, how to make something useful." "Why?" "Because I've spent 6 weeks organizing other people's economics, and I'd like to make something that exists outside of ledgers." Clara gestured at the forge, the tools, the iron waiting to be shaped. "And because you work alone, and that seems lonely." Jack studied her for a long moment, and Clara got the sense she was being weighed against some internal standard that had nothing to do with blacksmithing and everything to do with trust. "Gloves," he said, finally pointing to a shelf. "Heavy leather ones. And an apron. You'll stand here to my right. When I tell you to pump the bellows, you pump. When I tell you to stop, you stop. When I tell you to move, you move fast. Fire doesn't wait for indecision." Clara put on gloves that were too large and an apron that dragged the ground and took her position to Jack's right. He handed her a pair of tongs holding a piece of iron stock. "Feel the weight," he instructed. "Iron's heavy. If you're not ready for that, it'll pull you off balance." She gripped the tongs and understood immediately what he meant. The iron wasn't large, but it was dense. The kind of weight that accumulated over time until your arms burned and your shoulders ached. Jack positioned the iron in the forge fire. "Watch the color, black to red, to orange to yellow to white. We want orange for basic shaping, yellow for detail work. White means you've gone too far and the iron's starting to burn." Clara watched the iron heat, fascinated by the transformation from dull gray to glowing orange, the metal itself becoming light. "Now," Jack said. Clara pulled the iron from the fire, and Jack guided it to the anvil, positioning it with quick precision. His hammer fell in steady strikes, each blow deliberate and measured. The iron flattened spread, began taking a shape that might eventually become another scroll for the church bracket. Back in the fire, Clara returned the iron to the forge, pumping the bellows when Jack instructed, watching the orange glow intensify. They worked like this for an hour, Jack shaping and Clara managing the heating and cooling, falling into a rhythm that required no words because the work itself provided all the communication necessary. By the time the church bracket was finished, Clara's arms ached, and her face felt sunburned from the forge heat, and she understood why Jack's hands were covered in scars. "Not bad for first time," Jack said, examining the completed bracket. "You followed instructions. That's rarer than you'd think." "I'm good at following instructions when the instructions make sense. Most people aren't." He set the bracket aside to cool. "You can come back tomorrow if you want. I'm starting work on a new set of hinges for Tom Bradley's barn, simpler than church brackets. Better for learning." Clara pulled off the 2 large gloves. "Why are you being nice to me?" Jack looked genuinely confused by the question. "I'm not being nice. I'm being practical. You wanted to learn. I'm short on entertainment in winter. Teaching you gives me something to do besides work alone." "That's a terrible reason to teach someone blacksmithing." "It's the reason I have." Jack began banking the forge fire for the evening. "If you were expecting poetry about the beauty of mentorship or the joy of passing knowledge to the next generation, you came to the wrong blacksmith." Clara smiled despite herself. "Same time tomorrow, if the weather holds." She left the forge with hands that smelled of smoke and leather, and the particular scent of hot iron that she was learning to recognize as the smell of creation. Outside, early winter dark had already fallen, and the temperature was dropping fast. Clara walked back to the boarding house, through snow that crunched under her boots, and thought about the strange shape her life had taken. 2 months ago, she'd been working in a Boston textile factory, measuring her future in wages that never quite covered expenses. Now she was in Wyoming territory, learning blacksmithing from a widower who claimed he wasn't being nice, organizing cooperative purchasing for a dying town, and sleeping in a narrow bed that had somehow become more comfortable than any bed she'd occupied in the last 10 years. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd answered that mail-order bride advertisement, but it was more than she'd had before, and more felt like enough for now. Ida met her at the door with hot coffee and knowing eyes. "You've been at the forge." "Jack's teaching me basic smithing." "That's not what I asked." Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "What did you ask?" "Whether you've been at the forge," "which you have. Doing what is secondary to the fact that Jack Morrison let you into his space and trusted you enough to teach you his craft." Ida sat down at the kitchen table, gesturing for Clara to join her. "That man hasn't let anyone touch his tools in 3 years. Now he's teaching you. That means something. It means he was bored. It means he's healing." Ida's voice was gentle but firm. "Grief doesn't disappear. It just becomes something you carry differently. For 3 years, Jack's been carrying Anna's death like a weight that would crush him if he set it down. Now he's teaching someone blacksmithing. That's not boredom. That's a man remembering how to live in the present instead of the past." Clara sipped her coffee and didn't argue, because arguing would require examining feelings she wasn't ready to name. Jack Morrison was her teacher, her neighbor. The man who'd saved her life in a blizzard and now trusted her enough to hand her hot iron and expect her not to burn down his forge. Anything beyond that was speculation, and speculation was dangerous when your entire future balanced on $17 and the hope that a dying town could buy itself one more season. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Tom Bradley rode into town at dawn, his horse lathered, despite the cold, his face grim, in a way that made Clara's stomach drop before he'd even dismounted. "Trouble," he said to Jack, who'd emerged from the forge at the sound of hoofbeats. "Dutch Prescott and 5 of his men camped 15 miles south. They're coming this way." Jack's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted tension, replacing the relaxed competence Clara had grown used to. "When? Day, maybe 2. Depends on the weather." Tom's breath created clouds in the freezing air. "They've been hitting homesteads between here and Laramie, taking what they want, burning what they don't. 3 families wiped out in the last month." Clara had joined them now, along with Sam, who'd heard the commotion from his store. "Who's Dutch Prescott?" "Outlaw," Jack said flatly. "Runs a gang that winters in the territories, taking what they need from people who can't fight back. 6 men, all armed, all mean. If they're coming here, it's because they've heard Silver Creek has supplies." "We don't have supplies," Sam protested. "Just what people need to survive winter." "Which is more than they have." Tom dismounted, his movements stiff with cold and exhaustion. "We need to send someone to Fort Laramie for help. Army patrols these territories. If we can get soldiers here before Prescott arrives, we might have a chance." "Fort's 40 miles, Jack said. 2-day ride minimum in this weather. Prescott will be here before any help arrives." Clara's mind was already calculating, running through options the way she'd run through ledger problems. 6 armed men against 12 townspeople, most of whom were elderly or women. No law enforcement within 50 miles, no military presence closer than Fort Laramie. Silver Creek was isolated, vulnerable, and about to be tested in ways that bookkeeping skills couldn't solve. "What do they want?" she asked. "Money goods." "What's their usual demand?" "Whatever they can carry," Tom said. "Money if you have it, food, weapons, horses if you don't. And they're not gentle about taking it." "Then we give them what they want." All 3 men looked at Clara like she'd suggested setting the town on fire. "We don't negotiate with outlaws," Jack said, his voice hard. "We negotiate with reality." Clara's tone matched his for firmness. 6 armed men can take whatever they want from us. Fighting means people die. Running means losing everything and abandoning the town, but trading offering them supplies in exchange for safe passage that might get us through this." "They'll take the supplies and burn the town anyway," Sam said. "Maybe, but maybe not if we make it worth their while to leave us intact." Clara looked at Jack. "How much do you think 6 men and horses need to make it through winter?" Jack's jaw was tight. "Depends on where they're going and how long they plan to stay mobile. If they're heading south to Mexico, probably $500 worth of supplies. Food, ammunition, basic goods, maybe more. We don't have $500, Sam said. No, but we have $500 worth of goods. Clara turned to Tom. Your next supply run to Laramie. When is it? Was supposed to be in 10 days, but I can leave today if needed. Ride harder, get back in 2 days if the weather holds. What if you went now today, took 2 wagons instead of 1, bought double the normal supplies? We'd have enough to trade to Prescott and still have reserves for the town. Tom shook his head. That's $1,500 worth of goods. I don't have that kind of credit. But the town does collectively. Clara was already doing the arithmetic. If every household contributes what they can, and we leverage the credit we've built with suppliers through the cooperative purchasing system, we could manage it. It would put us in debt, but we'd be alive to pay it back. Jack crossed his arms. You're suggesting we buy supplies to give to outlaws who are coming to rob us anyway. I'm suggesting we control the transaction instead of being victims of it. Clara met his gaze without flinching. Dutch Prescott and his men are desperate. They're wintering in hostile territory because they have nowhere else to go. Desperate people take risks, but desperate people also respond to offers that let them get what they need without fighting for it. Silence fell over the group. Tom looked skeptical. Sam looked terrified. Jack looked like he was running calculations that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with risk versus survival. It's insane, Jack said finally. It's practical. Same thing in this case. Then help me make it work. Clara turned to Sam. Call a town meeting. Today. Everyone needs to hear this and vote on whether we try it. Sam nodded and hurried off toward the boarding house where Ida could help spread the word. Tom began unsaddling his exhausted horse. Jack remained where he was, studying Clara with an expression she couldn't read. You're either very brave or very stupid, he said quietly. I'm pragmatic. There is a difference. Not much of one. Enough of one to keep us alive. Clara started toward the boarding house, then paused and looked back. Are you going to help, or are you going to stand there questioning my intelligence? Jack almost smiled. Both, probably. The town meeting convened 2 hours later in the forge. 12 people gathered around the fire, trying to process the fact that their isolated survival experiment was about to be tested by armed men who had no investment in Silver Creek's continued existence. Clara stood before them and laid out the situation with the same clarity she'd used when explaining the cooperative purchasing system. Dutch Prescott was coming. Fighting was suicide. Running meant losing everything. Trading was the only option that gave them control over the outcome. How much would this cost? Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice trembling. $1,500 in goods. Each household would contribute based on ability. Some might contribute $50. Others might contribute $200. The key is that we buy in bulk, which means we get better prices and can offer Prescott more value than he'd get robbing us piecemeal. What if he takes the supplies and kills us anyway? One of the Donnelly brothers asked. That's possible. Clara didn't soften the truth. But it's less likely if we approach this as a business transaction rather than a robbery. Prescott's not a killer by preference. He's a thief. Thieves want maximum gain with minimum risk. If we hand him $600 worth of supplies and make it clear he can ride out without a fight, he's more likely to take the deal than waste ammunition and risk injury. Jack spoke from his position near the forge. I don't like it. Don't like negotiating with men who make their living terrorizing homesteaders. But Clara's not wrong about the math. 6 against 12, we lose. 6 against an offer of supplies that gets them through winter, we might walk away intact. Ida stood leaning heavily on her cane. I've lived through 3 territorial wars, 5 harsh winters, and more stupidity than I care to remember. This plan sounds insane. But insane that might work beats reasonable that definitely fails. I'm voting yes. Tom Bradley nodded slowly. I can make the supply run. Leave today, be back in 2 days if the weather holds. But I need commitments from everyone. Need to know people will pay for this gamble. One by one, the households committed. Some reluctantly. Some with the desperation of people who understood they had no better options. Within an hour, the town had pledged to finance the purchase of supplies that would be offered to outlaws in exchange for safe passage. Clara spent the rest of the day working out the logistics with Tom, calculating quantities and writing letters to suppliers explaining the urgent need for double orders. Jack contributed his own money without being asked $200 that represented months of forge work. Sam closed his store early to help organize the purchase list. By evening, Tom was ready to leave with letters of credit and purchase orders that would either save Silver Creek or bankrupt it trying. He mounted his horse and looked down at Clara with an expression that was equal parts respect and concern. "You better be right about this, Miss Whitfield." "I'm not right or wrong. I'm just calculating probabilities." Clara handed him the final supply list. "But the probability of us surviving a fight with Prescott's gang is 0. The probability of surviving a negotiation is better than 0. That's all we have to work with." Tom rode out as winter dark was falling, 2 empty wagons hitched behind his horse. Clara watched him disappear into the gloom and felt the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd just convinced 11 households to gamble their survival on her ability to negotiate with a man who had no reason to keep his word and every reason to take what he wanted and leave Silver Creek in ashes. Jack found her standing outside the forge an hour later, staring at the road where Tom had disappeared. "Second-guessing yourself?" he asked. "Calculating the odds of failure. What are they? High enough that I shouldn't sleep well tonight?" Clara turned to face him. "But lower than they'd be if we'd done nothing." Jack was quiet for a moment, his breath creating clouds in the freezing air. "You're good at this, taking impossible situations and finding the angle that makes them survivable. I'm good at arithmetic. This is just arithmetic with higher stakes. It's leadership. Same thing I'd have told you weeks ago. Same thing I've been watching you do since you arrived." Jack pulled his coat tighter against the cold. "Anna was like that. Could look at a problem everyone else thought was unsolvable and find the one solution no one had considered. That's rare." It was the first time Jack had mentioned his wife in conversation without being prompted. Clara understood the significance of that, the trust it represented. "What happened to her?" Clara asked gently. "Ida told me she died in childbirth, but not the details." Jack's face closed slightly, but he didn't refuse the question. "Baby was breech, couldn't turn. Anna labored for 30 hours while I watched her die by degrees and couldn't do anything except hold her hand and promise her everything would be fine." Which was a lie. We both knew it was a lie. But sometimes lies are all you have to offer. Clara's chest tightened with vicarious grief. "I'm sorry. 3 years ago. Feels like yesterday. Feels like a lifetime." Jack looked toward the cemetery on the hill. "Buried them both on a Tuesday morning. Ground was frozen. It took me 8 hours to dig deep enough. Pastor said words over them while I stood there covered in dirt and sweat, and tried to understand how the universe could be cruel enough to take both of them at once." "Is that when you decided to stay, after she died?" "Decided implies I made a choice. Staying wasn't a choice. It was just what happened when I couldn't figure out how to leave." Jack met her eyes. "Until recently I thought staying was the same as giving up. Now I'm not sure. Maybe staying is just another way of fighting." Clara understood then why Jack had taught her blacksmithing, why he'd contributed money to the Prescott supply purchase, why he'd supported her plan even though he hated negotiating with outlaws. He was done giving up. Done letting Silver Creek die by degrees while he watched and did nothing. "We're going to survive this," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Probably not, but we're going to try. Yes." Jack's smile was small but real. "We're going to try." Tom returned 2 days later with wagons loaded with supplies that represented Silver Creek's bet on survival. Flour, coffee, sugar, salt, pork, ammunition blankets, rope, basic tools. $600 worth of goods purchased on credit that would take the town 6 months to repay if everything went perfectly, and longer if anything went wrong. Clara inventoried everything with the meticulous attention she'd learned in factory work, checking quantities against purchase orders and making notes about what could be offered to Prescott and what needed to be held back for the town's survival. Dutch Prescott arrived the next morning with 5 men and enough weapons to take Silver Creek by force if he'd wanted. They rode in slowly, deliberately making sure everyone saw them coming and understood the implied threat. Jack stood in front of the forge with Clara beside him. Sam waited near the general store. Tom Bradley held a rifle but kept it pointed at the ground. The message was clear. Silver Creek wasn't going to fight, but it also wasn't going to roll over without terms being discussed. Prescott dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who knew he held all the advantages. He was maybe 50, weathered by years of living outside the law, with eyes that assessed Silver Creek's buildings and residents with the practiced evaluation of someone calculating value. "Heard there was a town up here," he said to no one in particular. "Didn't expect to find anyone still living in it." "Silver Creek's not dead yet," Jack said, "though I expect you're here to change that." Prescott smiled an expression that held no warmth. "Not necessarily. We're businessmen, same as anyone. We need supplies to make it south before winter gets worse. You've got supplies. Seems like there should be a way we can both get what we want without anyone getting hurt." Clara stepped forward before Jack could respond. "We anticipated you'd have needs. We've prepared an offer." Prescott's eyes shifted to her surprise flickering across his face before being replaced with calculation. "You're speaking for this town. I'm speaking for the practical reality that you need supplies, and we'd prefer not to be robbed." Clara gestured toward the wagons Tom had parked near the general store. $600 worth of goods. Food, ammunition, tools, blankets. Everything you'd need to make it to Mexico or wherever you're planning to winter. Take it and ride out peacefully. That's the offer. One of Prescott's men laughed. "Why would we take an offer when we can just take everything? Because taking everything means searching 40 buildings, most of which are empty or contain nothing of value. It means wasting time in hostile territory where Army patrols occasionally pass through. And it means making enemies of people who have nothing left to lose, which means someone probably gets shot." Clara kept her voice level businesslike. "Our offer gets you concentrated value immediately with no risk. That's better than robbery by every practical measure." Prescott studied her for a long moment. "You're not from around here." "Boston. Long way from home." "This is home now." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "And I'd like it to still be standing tomorrow. So does everyone else in Silver Creek. Take our offer. It's generous and it's smart." Prescott walked to the wagons and began examining the supplies, his men following to assess the value of what was being offered. Clara watched with her heart hammering against her ribs, every second of silence feeling like hours. Finally, Prescott turned back to Clara. "Who organized this, buying all these supplies just to hand them to us?" "I did." "Why?" "Because I'm good at arithmetic and bad at dying." Clara gestured at the town. "Silver Creek has 12 residents. You have 6 armed men. Those numbers don't work in our favor. But if I can turn those numbers into a transaction where you get what you need and we keep our lives, that's arithmetic I can work with." Prescott laughed, and this time it sounded almost genuine. "You've got spine, Boston. More spine than sense, probably, but spine counts for something." He looked at his men. "Load half of this into our packs. Leave the rest." Clara's breath caught. "The offer is for all of it. The offer is for whatever I say it is." Prescott's voice hardened. "You're giving us supplies to avoid getting robbed. I'm taking half and leaving half because taking everything would make me the kind of man who destroys towns for no reason. Consider it payment for your spine." It wasn't the deal Clara had proposed, but it was better than worst case. She nodded slowly. "Half. And you ride out today." "We'll ride out when we're loaded." Prescott gestured to his men, who began transferring supplies from the wagons to their horses and pack animals. The process took an hour, during which Silver Creek's residents watched in tense silence while armed outlaws moved through their town, taking what they'd been offered. When the loading was complete, Prescott mounted his horse and looked down at Clara one last time. "You should leave this place, Boston. Town's dying. You're too smart to die with it. Everyone keeps telling me that. Maybe everyone's right. Maybe everyone's been wrong before." Clara held his gaze. "Safe travels, Mr. Prescott." Prescott almost smiled. "You too, Miss Whitfield, though I suspect you'll need it more than I will." The gang rode out, heading south, their horses loaded with supplies that represented half of Silver Creek's bet on survival. Clara watched them disappear and felt her legs go weak with relief she hadn't let herself feel during the negotiation. Jack caught her elbow when she swayed. "Steady." "I'm steady, just processing the fact that we're still alive." "We're still alive and we're broke." Sam had joined them, his face pale. $300 worth of supplies gone. Another 300 we still owe to suppliers. That's 6 months of debt we just accumulated in 2 days. 6 months of debt we can pay back because we're not dead. Clara straightened, forcing her breathing to steady. Call another town meeting. Tonight. We need to reorganize the finances and figure out how to make this sustainable. The meeting that evening was subdued, the relief of survival tempered by the reality of debt that would take months to clear. Clara laid out the numbers with brutal honesty. Each household now owed more than they had before. The cooperative purchasing system would need to operate at maximum efficiency just to keep up with payments. There was no margin for error, no buffer for unexpected problems. "We'll manage it," Ida said firmly. "We've survived worse." "Have we, Mrs.?" Patterson asked quietly. "I can't remember a time when things felt this desperate." "Then you weren't paying attention during the winter of '83. Ida's voice carried the authority of lived experience. "We lost 4 people that year, 4 neighbors who froze or starved because we weren't organized enough to help each other. This year, we're organized. We've got systems. We've got Clara keeping the books and Jack keeping the forge running and Tom making supply runs. We're not just surviving anymore. We're fighting. And fighting means we've got a chance." The meeting ended with reluctant agreement. Everyone would continue paying into the cooperative system. Everyone would tighten their belts and make do with less. Everyone would hope that spring came early and brought with it opportunities to earn the money they needed to dig themselves out of debt. Clara walked back to the boarding house through snow that had started falling again, heavy flakes that promised another storm. Jack walked beside her without speaking, his presence solid and grounding in a day that had tested every assumption she'd made about survival and risk. At the boarding house door, she paused. "Thank you." "For what?" "For supporting the plan, for contributing money you couldn't afford to lose, for standing beside me when Prescott arrived instead of letting me face him alone." Jack was quiet for a moment. "You're part of Silver Creek now. That means when you take risks, we all take them with you. That's how towns work." "This doesn't feel like a town, it feels like a family. Maybe those are the same thing when the numbers get small enough." Jack pulled his coat tighter against the falling snow. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to pay for today's survival." He left, and Clara went inside to find Ida waiting with hot tea and the expression of someone who'd been watching through windows again. "You did well today," Ida said. "Prescott could have killed us all. Instead, he rode out leaving half our supplies and a story about the Boston woman who negotiated with outlaws. He left because the math made sense to him, not because of anything I did. He left because you made him see the math." Ida poured tea for both of them. "That's a gift, Clara. The ability to take chaos and fear and violence and turn it into arithmetic that even dangerous men can understand. Don't diminish that." Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "I'm not diminishing it. I'm just aware that it almost didn't work. If Prescott had been in a different mood or if his men had been hungrier for violence, we'd all be dead right now. But we're not. We're here drinking tea, planning how to pay debts that exist because we're alive to owe them." Ida sipped her tea. "That's victory, even if it doesn't feel like it." Clara went to bed that night exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. She'd gambled with 12 lives and won, but the winning felt hollow because it had cost so much and guaranteed nothing except the opportunity to keep fighting. Sleep came eventually, and with it, dreams of men on horses and wagons full of supplies in towns that hadn't quite given up but couldn't quite thrive, where every choice was just choosing how long you could postpone the inevitable. She woke to hammering. Jack's familiar rhythm, steady and purposeful, the sound of someone who'd decided that postponing the inevitable was the same as choosing to live. Clara dressed and went to the forge, where she found Jack working on something that looked like metalwork but was too intricate to be purely functional. He looked up when she entered, unsurprised by her presence. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Slept fine. Just woke up early." Clara moved closer to examine what he was working on. A rose. Iron petals individually shaped and welded thorns on the stem, every detail precise enough to be beautiful. "What is that for?" Jack set down his hammer. "Been working on it for 2 weeks. Every night after regular work is done. Thought I'd make something that wasn't just functional." He picked up the iron rose, turned it over in his calloused palm's fingers that had shaped every petal. Seems appropriate somehow, making something permanent out of material that wants to rust and decay, metaphor for what we're all trying to do here. It's beautiful. It's iron. Won't wilt like real flowers, but it also won't ever bloom. Jack set the rose down carefully. Been thinking about giving it to someone. Haven't decided if that someone would want it. Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. I think that someone would be honored to receive something so carefully made. Even if the person making it is a widowed blacksmith in a dying town with nothing to offer except iron roses and debt. Especially then, Clara met his eyes. Because iron roses last longer than real ones, and sometimes permanent, is better than perfect. Jack held her gaze for a long moment, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. A wall coming down, or maybe a door opening, or maybe just the acknowledgement that two people who'd survived enough to know better were choosing to hope anyway. "Clara Whitfield," he said slowly, "I'm not good with words, never have been. I work with my hands and let the metal speak for me. But there's something I need to say, and I'm going to say it badly, and you can laugh or leave or whatever feels appropriate." "I'm not going to laugh." "Don't promise that until you've heard what I'm saying." Jack took a breath. "These past months watching you organize this town and fight for people who didn't ask for your help and negotiate with outlaws like you, we're discussing a business contract instead of betting your life. I've felt something I thought died with Anna. Hope maybe. Or possibility. Or just the understanding that surviving isn't the same as living, and maybe I've been confusing the two." Clara's throat was tight. "Jack, let me finish, because if I stop now, I won't start again." He picked up the iron rose. "I made this for you. Took me 2 weeks because I wanted every petal perfect. Wanted to make something that would last, something that wouldn't wilt or fade or disappoint. Something like what I feel when I watch you work." He held out the rose. Clara took it with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of iron and intention. And 3 years of grief being carefully transformed into something that looked like hope. "It's not a proposal," Jack continued. "Not asking you to marry me or stay forever or make promises neither of us can keep. Just asking if maybe we could see where this goes, if maybe two people who've survived enough to know better might be willing to risk hoping again." Clara studied the iron rose, every petal, a small piece of careful work, every thorn, a reminder that beauty came with edges that could cut. "I came to Silver Creek expecting nothing except maybe shelter from a different kind of dying. Found a town that needed organizing, and a blacksmith who needed someone to argue with, and a reason to stay that wasn't just survival." She looked up from the rose to Jack's face. "Yes." "Yes, what?" "Yes, I want to see where this goes. Yes, I'm willing to risk hoping. Yes, I'll keep this rose and treasure it because someone spent 2 weeks making something permanent just for me." Clara's smile felt shaky. "That's 3 yeses. Most proposals only get 1. Jack's relief was visible. "This isn't a proposal." "Then what is it?" "A beginning. Maybe, if you're willing." "I'm willing." They stood in the forge with the iron rose between them and winter pressing against the windows, and Silver Creek continuing its slow dance between dying and surviving. Outside, 11 other people were waking up to a day that would require them to work harder than yesterday to pay for the debt they'd accumulated surviving. Inside, 2 people who knew better were choosing to hope anyway. Jack reached out slowly, giving Clara time to move away if she wanted. When she didn't, he pulled her into an embrace that smelled of smoke and metal, and the particular scent of someone who worked with fire. Clara leaned into his chest and felt something in her settle, like a piece of arithmetic finally balancing. "We should probably get to work," Jack said against her hair. "Got hinges to make and debt to pay and a town to keep alive through winter." "Probably." Neither of them moved. Spring came eventually, as it always did, bringing mud and melt and the slow understanding that Silver Creek had survived another winter. The debt from the Prescott supplies took 6 months to clear, paid off through careful management and collective effort, and the kind of stubborn determination that kept 12 people functioning as a town when logic said they should scatter. Clara and Jack were married in April, a simple ceremony in the forge with Ida officiating and 11 witnesses who'd become family through shared survival. The iron rose sat on a shelf in their apartment above the forge, permanent and beautiful and slightly dangerous, exactly like the life they were building together. 2 years later, Silver Creek's population had grown to 18. Tom Bradley's supply runs now included mail-order goods for families who'd heard about the town that had survived Dutch Prescott and decided that any place stubborn enough to negotiate with outlaws might be stubborn enough to thrive. 5 years after that, the railroad built a spur line that passed through Silver Creek, bringing with it commerce and growth and the transformation from ghost town to viable community. The cooperative purchasing system Clara had designed became a trading post that served homesteaders for 40 miles in every direction. 10 years after Clara's arrival, Silver Creek had a population of 120, a school, a church with bells that rang in a tower supported by Jack's decorative brackets, and a blacksmith shop that had expanded to employ 3 smiths besides Jack, all of them trained in the craft by a man who'd learned that teaching was just another form of creation. Clara and Jack had 3 children. Henry was born in 1886, strong and healthy in ways that felt like absolution for the child Jack had lost. Anna came 2 years later, named for the wife who'd made Jack into the man Clara had fallen in love with. Rose arrived in 1890, named for the iron flower that had started everything. They raised their children in the apartment above the forge in a town that had chosen survival over surrender and built something permanent out of those years when surrender seemed inevitable but was never chosen. The iron rose stayed on its shelf, gathering dust and stories, a reminder that sometimes the most permanent things were made by people who had every reason to give up and chose to create instead. Ida Henderson died in 1895 at the age of 79, surrounded by the town she'd helped keep alive through sheer force of will and strategic coffee. They buried her on the hill next to Anna and the baby, 3 people who'd shaped Silver Creek through presence and absence both. Sam Briggs retired in 1910, selling the general store to the Trading Post Cooperative that had grown from Clara's desperate arithmetic. He died peacefully 2 years later, his ledgers finally balanced after 30 years of patient work. Tom Bradley's ranch prospered, supplying beef to Silver Creek and 3 neighboring towns. Until his death in 1918, his supply wagons having carried more than goods over the years, they'd carried hope. The Patterson's small farm became the foundation of Silver Creek's agricultural economy, passed down to their grandson who still worked the land in 1935, growing wheat where his grandparents had grown vegetables. Sarah Mitchell trained 12 seamstresses before her death. In 1920, her legacy visible in the wedding dresses and christening gowns of every child born in Silver Creek for 2 generations. The Donnelly brothers opened a carpentry business that built half the houses in Silver Creek's expansion, years their work still standing when the town celebrated its centennial. Each of the original 12 had stayed when leaving would have been easier, had fought. When giving up would have been reasonable, had believed in Clara's arithmetic when arithmetic looked like madness. Their graves filled the cemetery on the hill, a record in stone of the people who'd refused to let a ghost town die. Jack and Clara grew old together, their hands equally scarred from work, their relationship forged through fire and hammer strikes, and the patient repetition of choosing each other every day for 40 years. They celebrated their 35th anniversary in 1920, surrounded by grandchildren who'd never known a world where Silver Creek wasn't thriving. Jack died in 1928 at the age of 86, peacefully in his sleep with Clara's hand in his. She eulogized him at a funeral attended by 200 people talking about the man who'd saved her life in a blizzard, and then spent 4 decades teaching her that survival was just the beginning of living. Clara lived 7 more years, continuing to manage the trading post that had grown from her desperate arithmetic, continuing to tell stories about the winter Dutch Prescott came to town and left with half what he'd demanded. She died in 1935 at the age of 79. Her last words to her granddaughter, Rose. A simple instruction, tell them we built something that lasts. They buried her next to Jack on the hill overlooking Silver Creek, a town that existed because 13 people had decided that dying slowly was better than dying fast, and surviving together was better than surviving alone. The iron rose sat in the Silver Creek Historical Museum, displayed behind glass, with a placard that read, "The Rose That Saved Silver Creek," forged by Jack Morrison. For Clara Whitfield Morrison, 1884, symbol of permanent love in a temporary world. Every spring on the anniversary of Clara and Jack's wedding, the museum placed fresh flowers beside the iron rose, real flowers that would wilt and fade. Iron flowers that would last forever. Both necessary, both beautiful. Both reminders that some loves forge legacies that outlast the people who created them. Silver Creek continued. The children grew and had children who had children. The trading post became a general store, became a community center. The forge operated for 5 generations each, Morrison teaching the next how to shape iron into useful things. And on quiet winter nights when the wind screamed like dying animals and the cold tested human endurance, people told stories about the Boston woman who'd arrived penniless with nothing but determination and an iron rose and built an empire of community from nothing but arithmetic and determination and the willingness to see possibilities where others saw only endings. Some loves don't end. They just transform, reshaping themselves like iron in a forge, taking new forms while remaining fundamentally permanent. Clara and Jack's love had done that. Started as survival shaped through crisis, hardened into partnership, and finally transformed into legacy. The iron rose remained, permanent, beautiful, dangerous if handled carelessly, exactly like everything worth building. And Silver Creek lived on proof that towns like people could endure when most would have quit if they were willing to endure one more year, one more generation, one more winter of stories about the people who'd refused to let endings be final. The arithmetic of hope, it turned out, was simple. You added up the days you survived, subtracted the losses you endured, and multiplied by the people who chose to stay. The result was never perfect, but it was enough. It was always enough.